Testing the V1 saliency hypothesis by a V1 model, Part 6. Let's use our V1 model to understand some more recent effects observed physiologically in real V1. This image contains a figure texture region of vertical bars and a ground texture region of horizontal bars. The figure texture is so narrow that all its texture bars are also texture border bars, so they suffer less from iso-orientation suppression and evoke relatively higher responses in our model. And this is also observed in real V1, and this is called the figure ground effect. However, when the middle texture region is wider, some of its bars are no longer texture border bars, so their responses are under a larger extent of iso-orientation suppression. In fact, they are under a stronger suppression since they have strong border bars as their iso-orientation neighbors, both from the left and from the right. So let's call this a border suppression region. Their evoked responses are even weaker than those by the background texture bars. When the middle texture is even wider, its middle region is too far from the border bars to suffer from the suppression arising from these border bars because the intracortical neural connections in V1 are not long enough. The responses to the middle region are under weaker iso-orientation suppression because they are flanked by weakened iso-orientation neighbors. So their evoked responses are stronger than those from the background texture bars. Therefore, this medial axis is somewhat more salient than the background texture bars, and we call this the medial axis effect. This effect is a side effect of the V1's contextual influences. It is perhaps not strong enough to be obvious in saliency visual behavior, but this enhanced response to the medial axis has been observed in real V1. It should occur only when this foreground texture has a certain width or size, because when the texture region is even wider, then its medial axis is no more salient than the background texture bars, since it's too far from the border suppression regions. Across different sizes of the foreground texture region, the figure ground effect for the figure to evoke higher V1 responses occurs only for small figures. The medial axis effect should occur only for certain sizes of the textures, otherwise it could be useful for marking skeletons for figures. However, regardless of the sizes, the texture borders always evoke higher V1 responses. This should help with texture segmentation. Some physiological experiments measure the responses of V1 neurons to a grating centered on the receptive field and see how the response varies with the size of the grating. From a small grating to a larger one, first the response increases with the size of the grating, and then it reaches an optimal size of the grating, which evokes a peak response level, and then the response becomes smaller for increasingly larger gratings. Let's try to model this by our V1 neuron. The smallest input to our model neuron is a bar. We enclose it by this dashed yellow circle. It could model a small grating. A larger grating is this one. The receptive field of our neuron is at its center, and the next larger grating, the next larger one, and the next larger one. So these sizes should be the optimal sizes as they correspond to the size of the receptive field. Therefore, the smallest grating in the data is too small for our model neuron's receptive field, but it could be trivially sampled as a weaker input to our model neuron. So we will just ignore this trivial case. And these are the larger and larger gratings. And these are our model V1 responses to these grating patterns. The responses from the neuron at the grating centers are highlighted in these yellow discs. The decreasing responses at the center of larger gratings agree qualitatively with physiological data. These model responses are easily understood from our observations of how the responses to the center of a texture region change with the texture size. When the grating is small, the center of the grating is in the strong figure border region. For larger grating sizes, the center of the grating is in the border suppression region, suppressed by the strong periphery of the grating. Then we can expect that as the grating becomes even larger, we should encounter the situation when the center response recovers, when they should be highlighted as part of the medial axis. And this indeed happens. This is the response pattern to an even larger grating. And here is a strong response to the medial axis of this grating. This means that at a certain point for an even larger grating, the real V1's response should increase again. One can also release the center of this grating from the inhibition by adding an orthogonal grating around it. The surrounding grating suppresses the responses to the peripheral part of the central grating, and consequently iso-orientation suppression to the very center is reduced. So this can give an apparent enhancement of the neural response to the very center by an cross-orientation surround, as observed in neural data. V1's contextual inferences on neural responses also depend on the visual input strength. A weaker visual input would typically give such a response curve. Not only do the response levels drop, but the peak response is for a larger grating, as if the size of the neuron's residual field has increased. This is because this neuron's response to the direct input within the residual field is influenced by not only the iso-orientation suppression from its left and right neighbors, but also enhancement from its collinear or co-aligned upper and lower neighbors. We recall that the enhancement depends on the monosynaptic excitations from the excitatory neurons, but the suppression needs to go through also the inhibitory interneurons. We recall that the interneurons' response grows steeper with stronger input drives, so the suppression is relatively less effective at weaker input drives. Consequently, the response can grow for a larger range of sizes before the suppressive effects become visible. We have seen from our examples that contextual suppressions are the dominant mechanisms behind visual saliency effects. Indeed, in real behavior, texture segmentation and pop-out of unique features work better when the image contrast is not too weak, so that isofeature suppression in V1 can work effectively to serve such purposes.